Welcome, Tyler Thompson. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I want to share this video with my students and with my clients and anyone who's interested in making a career out of their negotiation skills because you have done that. So Tyler is a founding member of the US State Department's Negotiation Support Unit and is a senior negotiations advisor with nearly 2 decades of experience. So I want to ask you all sorts of questions, Tyler, and some follow-up questions because really your experience is fascinating, particularly to someone like me who deals more with business negotiations, B2B negotiations, dyadic negotiations, where you have advised on negotiations between countries. You advised ambassadors, you advised special envoys. I mean, that is just fascinating to me. So I've got so many questions. But I want to start with where did you train? Where did you learn to negotiate?
Hi, yeah. So my training is actually it was definitely cumulative. I didn't start out as a negotiations expert by any means. My training is actually legal, so I'm a lawyer by trade in here in the United States, and I studied international law, public international law, the law of armed conflict, and those aspects. I was also a student of transitional governments, as we call them, or governments coming out of armed conflict and trying to forge a way into a peaceful path,
Where
more
did you
represent
study this?
at American University in Washington D.C. They have a joint law and master's in international affairs program there, and so I developed an expertise in this legal aspect, and that was my first foray into conflict negotiations space. I worked for a law professor who ran an NGO called the Public International Law and Policy Group. It was a nonprofit. And that organization provided legal advice to parties in conflict. And so my first exposure to conflict negotiations was actually as a legal advisor on technical issues, whether it's constitution drafting or transitional governance, or if you have independence, like what happens to all the obligations of the prior state that you're declaring independence from? Like, what does the new state have in terms of obligations, treaty obligations, debts and assets obligations, and things like that? And so I was able to come into those processes as a legal advisor on those issues and get sort of on the job training for what it looked like to actually negotiate. I was a researcher. I was providing options and ideas for frameworks that would be proposed at the table. And it took me many years to actually be comfortable enough to be exposed to negotiation dynamics to really feel like I knew what was going on in the negotiation space. And in that meantime, I was taking seminars, probably like the ones that you teach, and understanding, reading a lot of books about negotiation doctrine to incorporate that sort of technical legal strategy to negotiation doctrine and strategy.
Wow. So my follow-up question has to be, what was your favorite book then? Do you remember any of these books that you read
Yeah,
early in your career?
I really nerd out on the books. So 3D Negotiation is one of my favorites, the
Mhm.
Jim Sebanius book, because I feel like it takes a lot of great negotiations literature and kind of really makes it into an actionable approach where it's not just thinking about, okay, I'm at the table, what do I say to the different parties, but also how do I set up the entire environment, like everything before getting to the table? What should I be doing before I'm negotiating to make sure I understand what I'm getting into and that I'm shaping the environment around? To me, that took a lot of the edge off of like in the room dynamics. I tend to get a lot of anxiety when I'm just focused on like, okay, how's this meeting gonna go? What do I need to say? What if I get it wrong? The stakes of every individual meeting are a lot lower when you can like really map out the strategic landscape beyond that.
100%. I
Yeah.
think that's the mistake that a lot of negotiators make, that they focus on how do I have influence in the room? How do I persuade? What do I say? How do I become dominant in the conversation? Instead of how do I focus on the planning aspect of their
Yeah.
preparation and what plan do I have? What options? Because you mentioned that you provided options.
Hmm.
Um, And that, I have a friend, a colleague who did some research. I think it was, can't remember if it was while he was in China or after he'd moved to Australia, but he researched, does conscientiousness have an impact, have an effect on whether a negotiator succeeds or not? And it turns out from his research that conscientiousness, when applied to planning, has an impact on how someone will negotiate. Not necessarily conscientiousness applied at the table while you're actually negotiating. So, what's
Right.
important is the planning phase. And when you say that you provided options, I mean, I wish I had someone to support me to provide options so that I can, I mean, I do that work myself. And in the sheer negotiation model that I preach, that presentation of multiple options to the other party is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
What do you think are essential negotiation skills, or can you pick out some things, some skills that a negotiator must have in order to be successful?
Well, first on your strategy, I think that's brilliant because the idea of providing multiple options as an offer is such an underutilized tool because you learn so much by what they choose, right? You
Right.
learn you learn so much about what other value you can add. You like learn about what people care about, and so that kills a lot of birds with one stone, so to speak. But
Even if they don't choose any option, but they say, look, I have a preference for option
yeah.
two, but it's not going to fly. Like it needs to be tweaked a little bit. You get a lot of information there.
Yeah. So for the main thing I like to tell people is like we probably the most important thing, and it's almost cliche for those who have like read a lot of negotiation books, but like is to not only understand the options, but understand like the alternatives and not just your alternative to this negotiation, but like everybody's alternative to the negotiation. Because without knowing that, especially about your counterpart, kind of it's so easy to just fall flat or just kind of like not resonate with the other side. If they don't, if you as a negotiator don't have a full understanding of like why does this person across the table need me? Like why are they even talking to me? And like what are their options outside of talking to me, right? In this process. Um, so that's always like I always kind of start with that. Um, and then the other piece is really having folks think through sequencing, right? So like not just are we going to get a deal at this meeting, but like can you break a process into multiple parts where you're we call it confidence building measures, right? In the conflict world, where you you show that you can collaborate on something small, and then if that succeeds, can you expand what we're talking about to go to
Mhm.
bigger and bigger options? And usually, if you take like smaller chunks out of the problem, you build collaboration, and a lot can happen if you build that trust first.
So, how do you plan this trust building process? Do you, I mean, I'm interested, what sort of work would you do as an advisor? Would you learn about the other party to understand how to build trust with them? Do you always apply the same tactics to build trust? Do you have a methodology?
It always comes down to finding out what they care about. And when it comes to confidence building measures, it's always good to rank like what do these people care about the absolute most? Like what's the most sacred thing that
Mhm.
fighting for or negotiating for, and then try to find some subcategories or other things that are slightly less close or important to them and start with those things, right? And when it comes to confidence building, when it comes to armed conflict, there's a few like tried and true confidence building measures that are you often see in many negotiations, and like those are hostage swaps, prisoners of war swaps, where it's like, okay, you're one side is giving up some of the people they have, the other side's giving up some of the people they have, with the full understanding that like they will likely capture more like as the conflict goes on or if it's not resolved. The second is like short-term ceasefires, right? So like you can stop the fighting for a day, a week, but keeping the leverage of being able to start fighting again. The third is just information sharing. So if you say, okay, we're going to share the location of our troops and assets, if you share the locations of your troops and assets, and like we'll agree to like move them around like to different places or report on the movements, like all of those things, they don't change the trajectory of the conflict, they don't change the leverage, or they not in a significant way the leverage that one or the other side has, but it shows like a willingness to cooperate, at least nominally. And so that could be applied across a bunch of different sectors or a bunch of different fields. Like if you're trying to gauge the trust that you can put in another side, you try something low stakes like a short-term license or a smaller stake deal, before you get deeper into arrangements with them.
That's so interesting. Okay, can you tell us about an armed conflict that you were involved in,
Yeah, I was
something that you
involved.
can share?
Yeah, so before government, those are the ones that are easiest for me to talk about, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I should give a little bit of. So I worked for the Public International Law and Policy Groups, this NGO, like I mentioned, that does peace negotiations. But after I worked for them, then I went into I worked directly for Syrian American advocacy organizations. Before I was in joined government, my biggest conflict portfolio was Syria. So I advised various components of the Syrian opposition in their negotiations with the Assad government at the time, and Russia, right? Because Russia was often at the table with them or near them, and that was the sort of block, the entities that we were working with or trying to talk to. So that's the probably the longest standing conflict that I was involved in, prior to joining government. And then in government, you can probably guess, there's a bunch, both armed and unarmed political situations that we were engaged with.
Yeah, I mean, the Syria conflict is just so complex. I
Yeah,
don't know how you would even start to make sense of it all. If you think about mapping of stakeholders, I reckon the Syria context would take months to map out. No? Because there are so many rebel groups and there are so many different tribes and minorities there, and it's just not a unified country in any way. Um, do you then have to apply systems thinking in order to understand the system of pressures on each party and to understand their alternatives? How much research do you need to do?
a lot, a lot. The When it comes to Syria, I was involved quite early. 2000, late 2010, early 2000, 2011, was when I first became involved with advising some opposition folks in their strategy and planning. And so I starting that early, it was simpler at the beginning, right? So at the beginning, you had a lot of dynamics that led to the Syrian regime cracking down, and people protesting as part of the Arab Spring processes. And it was an unarmed civil resistance movement that was, so at that point, it was relatively simple. Like there were different um, components, right, of that civil resistance, like people who wanted different things. But it got much more complicated every month that went on. Once it became violent, once the Assad government started attacking people, and then arms flowed in on the other side. every month that arms were flowing into Syria on the opposition side, that's when the stakeholders got very, very complex, because you had um, outside a lot of outside countries pouring money and weapons in, because it was now violent, a violent conflict. Now you have identity groups and different regional constituencies within the country feeling that existential threat, right? And so the costs and risks of working together increased for them. And so things definitely started to fracture. And that's where the systems thinking really did have to come in a very significant way, because you had many, many different feedback loops playing on each other to impact the not only negotiation dynamics, but the geopolitical dynamics and the
Yeah.
conflict itself, like what was
And the
happening on the.
interests would have been changing. Because I
Yes,
can imagine you've got, in the Syria conflict, you've got at the very least Iran, Turkey, Russia, Lebanon involved, or funding, or they have an interest in what's happening in that country.
way more than that. Yeah, you had
Yeah,
actually less so Lebanon at the time, because a lot of that was coming from Iran, right? So the
right.
so Iran was a big one. They were sort of like the boots on the ground, so to speak, for the Assad government. The Russians were sort of the air force and the supplier for a lot of funding for the Assad government. Then on the opposition side, once it was armed, you started to see a lot of the fracture. You had Turkey, almost all the Gulf states. You had the United States, uh, a bunch of European countries that were all dumping money and weapons into Syria for a long time.
Can I ask who you were advising there?
Yeah,
Is
so
that confidential information, or can you share?
some of it's confidential, but I can share enough. So at the beginning, we were advising um, two different groups. One was a students, like young people inside Syria that were participating in protests and getting arrested and trying to figure out what options they had, like how they could build leverage, how they can build international attention. The second was groups of pro democracy Syrians who were in exile, who have been in exile for since the early 2000s, let's say. And so they have been thinking strategically about, if the opportunity arose, like what would be their path forward for the country, et cetera. So early on, it was those two types of groups. Then, once there was an armed opposition, they built a political wing that doesn't exist anymore because things have changed significantly in Syria. But it was called the Etilaf, which was like the Syrian Opposition Coalition. It was a coalition of different political groups who represented different armed groups. And that coalition was who I advised in the Geneva peace process for a long period of time.
And what sort of advice did they need from you?
So it was similar to what I had mentioned before, and I had given this flavor of advice in a bunch of different contexts. But essentially, they were in negotiation with the Assad government, and they were trying to find pathways for a transitional government, right? So, like, what would they need to see change about the Syrian state, about the social contract between government and its people, about the role of the military in the country, what constitutional provisions they would want to see. What do we do about accountability for all the crimes that have happened now during the conflict?
Yeah.
All of those transitional governance issues is one band. The other, a big through line in my career is ceasefire. So I'm a ceasefires expert by, from my early research and experience, and then just kind of trickled through my career. I've written a book on ceasefires, and so
What's the name of
ceasefire.
the book? Just so that we know.
It's called the Ceasefire Drafter's Handbook, and it's published by the Public International Law and Policy Group (PILPG), where I worked, and the U.S. Institute of Peace, which no longer exists. So we can get into that about the crackdown on conflict work here in the United States, but anyway, yeah. So I was advising them as well on ceasefire issues and how they would negotiate both short-term and long-term permanent ceasefires.
I have to ask this question. It's just so timely. There's a ceasefire deal on the table at the
Yeah.
moment between Israel and Palestinians. Do you think it will be accepted by Hamas?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, one of the benefits of being outside of government at this point is that for better or worse, I don't have visibility on recent plans and things like that. But really, it's going to depend on the good faith and not good faith, but the interests of both sides in understanding, like, what do they get out of joining it? What do they get out of not? And that's been kind of the dance this whole time about, like,
Sure.
are we meeting the interests of the Israeli government? Are we meeting the interests of Hamas? And then, like, a step back from that is, are we meeting the interests of the Israeli people, and are we um, meeting the interests of the Palestinian people, right? And so, and those two things don't often align. And so we'll see. It's a 20-point plan, from what I've heard in the media, and it's all going to depend on that leverage, right? That I think other countries can apply on the situation.
Systems thinking again.
Yeah.
Um, okay, I think I'll end with this question, or maybe two questions. Um, Knowing what you know, actually, no, this is the question I'd like to ask you. When you're advising on a complex negotiation between multiple parties, is your approach to think like a mediator? Because you've said now that everything will depend on everyone's interests, right? Can we meet the parties' interests? Does that mean that you take a neutral mediator role in order to find the right solution to a conflict? Or do you find yourself siding with the party that you're advising and thinking about how to best meet their interests while perhaps manipulating the other side's?
Yeah, I the latter, right? So I have a couple of times in my life, mainly at the State Department, have I been sort of in a mediation role, or that the U.S. government has been in a mediation role. The vast majority of my career, I've been an advisor to a particular side who wants to win or have gained the most that they can, claim the most value in a negotiation. And so, and even in my legal training, like, my mindset is often on that, like, how do you achieve the most, create the most value, but then claim the most value for one or both, or for one side. um but I should say, like, I'm not cynical or Machiavellian, right? So, like, I am of the mindset that the best path forward is to maximize the pie, right? Like,
Mhm.
make the most value as possible, and then claim what value you can, when that pie is maximized, because um, usually that creates more satisfaction and therefore more durable
Sure.
solutions. But um, I find too, like, even when as a mediator, because um, I've had so much exposure to, like, how sides think, I still am trying to think like them, both sides, about sort of, like, well, what's their theory of the case? What do they hold sacred? How do they interpret the facts? Like, what do they hold to be the truest of the true? And what's the difference between their interpretation of the facts and the other sides, on those sacred core issues that they have? Because that kind of gives you a little bit of a shadow of where the path might be. And also, mediators themselves are never neutral, right? It's especially in conflict. Like, there's always
Mhm.
preferred outcome, or there's some outcome that they would like to
Well, they have their
see.
own interests, yeah.
Yeah, they have their own interests, right? And so the mediator, if I were to, like, program in, like, mediator mode, it's never like, oh, just neutral. It's like there's always something that the mediator wants to see come out. And so, um, you know, neutrality, I think, is a myth.
Yeah, I love that. That's very honest. Thank you for your honesty. It's very true.
Yeah.
Um, All right, so this is my last question then. Of all of your experience and all your insights in working with rebel groups, with ambassadors, with uh, all sorts of international organizations and on international issues, what do you think are transferable insights for, say, my students who are in management roles or in executive roles? And what can you teach them about good negotiation practices?
Yeah, I think one of the most common um, problems, I think, with negotiation training in general and sort of negotiation theory and practice is that it's often taught and applied when it comes to interpersonal. Like I'm negotiating with, Jim on the other side of the table, and it's like person to person negotiations. But so often, what is really happening is that institutions are negotiating with each other, company to company, or country to country. And those institutions have agents who have their own individual personalities, right? But the institutions themselves have personality and structure that is really important to think about in engaging in a negotiation. So, for example, like, okay, if we're negotiating with, let's say, a country in the Middle East, we're talking to their foreign ministry, we're talking to their Ministry of Finance, but until we realize that the actual decisions that are being made and the real power center in this negotiation is their Ministry of Intelligence, we're talking to the wrong people and we're having the wrong kind of conversation, or we're not understanding even what we're talking about, or who we're talking to when it comes to this institution. The same is true in private sector negotiations, right? Like if if you're talking to folks about research and development or some new product line or something like that, but the counterpart that you're working with on the other side, like the true folks that are driving this company's engagement, like maybe that company's in crisis and it's the finance department that
Mhm.
is the key node in this negotiation. It's important to know that, right? Even if you're talking to like the nicest or hardest bargaining person, um, from whatever department or from the C-suite of that company. And so that sort of structured, the institution to institution framework is something that people should be thinking about all the time. Once they've mastered the like interpersonal negotiation and like getting to know the person on the other side, that piece is really important.
Yeah, there's a lot of research involved there. And I'm sure
Yeah.
my students would then ask you, how do I find out that information? And how long would it
Mm-hmm.
take? But maybe that's another conversation. Um, I want to end with telling whoever is listening that Tyler is now working on combining AI with negotiations. Maybe just tell us what your company is called, and maybe in the next conversation we can go into that.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm a co-founder and the chief negotiation officer at a company called Expeditionary, and so we are focused on integrating artificial intelligence and other tech tools to tried and true negotiation consulting approaches, and we take this institutional systems based approach, right? So our clients are large corporations and governments, and we help them understand their own institution so that they can negotiate as an institution and not in silos or without a sort of a coherent strategy and approach. And it's been very exciting.
It's extremely exciting because everyone's interested in how AI will impact negotiations. Will AI negotiate for us? And you're saying, well, actually, AI can help us understand our own our own institutional structures, our own culture, and perhaps help us in the future with what you said before is so important, understanding the other party's institution, their culture, the way things happen there, their priorities and their interests. It all comes back to interests. So thank you so much. What a fascinating conversation. And I'm sure that we'll have more. And if you're willing, we'll have another recorded conversation on all of these other aspects that we didn't have time to talk about. Thanks so much,
Absolutely.
Tyler.
Thank you.